In this video, we will continue covering chapter 8.5 of the book Spring Boot Quick Start. More precisely, we will show how to use createNamedQuery method of the Entity Manager in order to execute named queries and to demonstrate how we can use named queries in this way to read, update, or delete records. So the main focus of this tutorial is this database access class that will be referencing and executing named queries which are defined inside the person entity. So here is a quick overview of the most important code of this tutorial. So we will have a person entity, and in that class will be annotated with multiple named queries in order to define different JPQL queries that will either select, delete, or update an entity. So here we have only shown such named query that specifies a select JPQL that selects a person by using these following two indexed parameters. And this is the name that we have given to our named query. Then we will show how we can use createNamedQuery method of the Entity Manager to reference such named query by providing its full name as defined here. Then we will set the parameters of the created query like this, since we are like this in case of index parameters, and then we can simply execute query by calling getSingleResult in the case of select statement. So this is how our application will look like. We will have application properties file, which will be used to configure properties for H2 database and properties for Hibernate. We will have load persons class, which will use native query to insert a record into database so that we have some record to work with. And it will use native query because JPQL does not support ability to insert records. So this is why we are here using native query. This is our person entity, where we will define following three named queries: one that selects, updates, or deletes a record, and each will be given a different name, and they will be using either indexed parameters or named parameters. And our property entity will have following properties. We will have a controller with three endpoints in order to demonstrate and call each of these named queries, and these endpoints will simply call methods from a database access class, and it is there where the JPQL queries will be actually executed. So this is our database access class, which is the main focus of this tutorial, because in this class we have created methods that actually reference and execute our named queries. So this method will be referencing and executing select person named query. This method will be using update person named query, and this one delete person named query. So these are named queries that we have defined here in our person entity: select person, update person, and delete person. So from these methods we are referencing them, and then we can set the parameters and execute them. Since JPQLs which update and delete contain update and delete statements, they need to be in a methods that are annotated with transactional. And since endpoints cannot be annotated with transactional, we couldn't put this code in the controller endpoints, for instance here or here. And this is the reason why we have created this additional database access class, so that we could have methods that can be annotated with transactional, so that these methods can have the code to update or delete database, because that code could not be placed inside the controller's endpoints. Now for the select method, we don't need transactional annotation, but this is still placed in the same database access file so that all three methods are in the same class. So let's now take a closer look at these methods in the database access class. So here we have select person method, which references this named query person select person. So this is our first named query person select person, which selects a person entity from database by using these index parameters. So after referencing a named query using createNamedQuery method of the entity manager, we can set those two properties of the JPQL, and then we can execute our query by calling this method, and it will return a person entity. This entity is then returned back to the controller's endpoint, and it will be displayed, also returns from the endpoint to be displayed in the web browser in the form of a JSON string. So the second method in this database access class is the one that references person update person named query. So this is this second named query update person, which will update person that has this name with this value. So here we are specifying that we want to find person entity with name John and to update age with value 200. And we can then execute this query by using execute update method, in contrast to this method when we were just selecting a record. So this method will return number of updated records, and we are then returning this number to our endpoint, which is calling the database access method, and then we display this result to the console. And then we have the third endpoint, which calls delete person method of the database access class. So this is delete person method, and this method executes references and executes this named query person delete person. So this is this last named query person delete person, which will delete a person which has name set to this parameter. In this case, this is John, so we are setting this named parameter name to value John. Here we can execute our delete JPQL, and it will return number of records deleted, and this number will be returned back to the endpoint here. And then the endpoint will create this string and display it in a web browser to inform the user how many records have been deleted. We can now test this application by using Google Chrome web browser and entering URL of the first endpoint, which selects a person entity from the database, and this endpoint then returns this database and represents it as a JSON string. So this is this first endpoint, which calls select person of the database access. And this select person then references this named query person select person from the person entity. So this is this query which selects a person entity from the database with these parameters. And we can then call the URL of the second endpoint that updates a person record and returns the number of records that have been updated. So this is this second endpoint that calls update person method of the database access class. And this method references person update person named query. This is this one, update person, which updates this person and changes the age value to this value, and then returns the number of affected records back to the endpoint. And lastly, we can call the URL of the last third endpoint, which deletes record and returns number of records deleted. So this is our third endpoint. It calls delete person from database access class. And this delete person method references named query person delete person from our person entity. This is this person delete person, which deletes a person entity with this name, and then returns number of deleted records back to the endpoint. So the main point of these tutorials was to show how to use createNamedQuery of the createNamedQuery method of the entity manager in order to reference a named query defined in our person entity, and this is how we can reference and execute these named queries from anywhere in the code. After the query has been referenced, we can set the parameters depending if they are indexed or named, and then we can execute the query. And we just need to have in mind that in case the query is supposed to update or delete a record, then the methods that are executing these queries need to be annotated with transactional annotation, and the queries that are just selecting records do not need to have this annotation. And we should also remember that transactional annotation cannot be applied to the endpoints, which is why we had to create these methods in another class, and then the endpoint is just calling those methods and getting the returned values.